read-only mode.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Mike Azar, Communications Specialist here at MPERS, and I'm thrilled to host this session as we take a closer look at the key milestones that define MPERS' success and guide our path forward. Milestones are more than just markers of progress. They serve as critical indicators of where we stand and where we're heading. For an organization like MPERS, these milestones span vital areas such as benefit administration, financial stability, budget management, communication, and investment performance. Today, we'll explore these areas in depth with MPERS Executive Director Scott Simon, who will provide insights into the system's recent achievements and discuss how these successes position us to better serve you, our members. Before we dive in, I want to remind everyone that we welcome your questions during this session. Please send them in through the chat, or you can email them to communications@mpers.org, and we'll do our best to address them during the presentation. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists for today. First, I'd like to introduce Greta Bassett-Seymour, Deputy Director and General Counsel for MPERS. Since joining the organization in 2014, Greta has been a vital legal advisor to the MPERS Board of Trustees and Executive Director, ensuring compliance with system laws and overseeing investment-related legal support. Next, please welcome Katie Lacey, MPERS Human Resources Officer. Katie joined MPERS in 2023 and brings extensive expertise in human resources. She oversees a wide range of HR functions, including recruitment, employee development, compensation, and workplace safety, while also managing MPERS facility operations. I'm also pleased to introduce Jennifer Even, the Chief Financial Officer of MPERS. Since joining the organization in 2006, Jennifer has played a pivotal role in MPERS financial operations, from implementing accounting systems to producing award-winning financial reports. With over 27 years of experience in accounting and finance, Jennifer's expertise ensures the accuracy and integrity of MPERS financial processes. Finally, please join me in welcoming Scott Simon, Executive Director of MPERS. Since 2012, Scott has been at the helm of MPERS, transforming it into a sophisticated pension plan focused on customer service and risk management. With over 28 years of experience in customer service and leadership, he brings a wealth of knowledge to his role, guiding MPERS in strategic objectives and effective governance. And now I'm pleased to turn it over to Scott to kick off today's session.
All right, thank you, Mike, and thanks to the exec team here for joining us today. When we started these State of the System events a few years ago, our purpose was to get members and stakeholders more acquainted with the system. For members, the clear point of interest lies with the benefit you have earned or will earn, and we understand that. We also believe it's important to know more about the general condition of the system. Keep that spirit in mind as we go through the presentation today. So what are the milestones? And by the way, both of these are funded status related. And on the next couple of slides, I will use excerpts from our valuation report to explain them. But the first one is that MPERS retiree liability is fully funded for the first time in system history. And the second is MPERS has achieved the highest funded status in system history. So here is the first excerpt. As I mentioned, the most recent valuation report reflects this liability. The retiree liability is fully funded. Well, what is the retiree liability? It is the total amount owed to those receiving a benefit. That amount was fully funded for the first time last year. Now keep in mind that benefits earned are supposed to be funded while an individual is actively employed. In other words, contributions on an individual's basis start when you first become employed and stop upon termination. During that period, your benefit should be mostly funded. Note I said mostly. Actuarial science is not precise, so it is not unusual for funding levels to fall short of the fully funding level. Let's pause for a moment to reflect on this milestone. MPERS was created in 1955, and in 2023, it was the first time this liability was fully funded. Here is another excerpt from the valuation report illustrating the second milestone. Here again, this is the second year in a row that we can say MPERS overall funded status is the highest it has ever been. If you have watched my annual financial status update that comes out in October each year, you know that the funded status represents the ratio of assets available to cover the benefits that have been earned. MPERS' ultimate goal is to be fully funded or to have a funded status of 100%. Clearly, there is work to be done, but you can see significant process from the low in 2010. And I'll stop for a moment so you can digest this chart. A lot of bars on this chart, but if you look at the low point there in the middle of the chart in 2010, you can see the lowest point that our funded status recognized and the progress as it goes to your right to the current date in 2024 at just over 70%. Now, you may be asking yourself, why are we just now achieving these milestones, or why has the funding been a challenge? Well, there are a number of factors, but two rise to the top in my opinion. The first being that we had pre-funding issues and there was a lack of dedicated staff. First, with the pre-funding issues, one of the fundamental aspects of a defined benefit plan like ours is that you pre-fund the benefits. You don't pay it as you go. And for whatever reasons, there were roughly a dozen benefits provisions, that were not pre-funded until 1999. So that set us back a bit when those pre-funding issues were identified. And then the second, and perhaps more importantly in my view, is the lack of dedicated staff. I already mentioned that we were created in 1955, and we did not have dedicated staff for the system until 1988. So think about that for a minute. 1955 we were created, and not until 1988 did we have a dedicated staff person for the system. Some of the other factors you can see there that contributed to the funding shortfalls of the past are conservative investment history. There was a time where employee contributions were in place. Just to give you a bit of history there, when the system was created in 1955, employee contributions were prevalent, and those were taken away in the 70s and refunded in the late 70s. There were extended amortization periods, and we're going to come back to that in just a moment and talk some more about that part of it. And then there were significant market declines that occurred, and the two most recent since the year 2000 were the tech bubble in 2001, and everyone remembers the great financial crisis in 2009 and 10. So all of those things contributed to some of the funding shortfalls and challenges that we've faced over the years.
And Scott, this is Katie. I just wanted to jump in. You mentioned the lack of dedicated staff until 1988. I just want to say that today we have 21 employees working at MPERS, 7 of which are dedicated investment staff that are managing our over 3.8 billion trust fund. And then our other 14 are benefits and operations staff. So those are people that you talk to when you call in or go to meetings, and just really how much we've grown over the years, and how great our staff is doing here, I want to point out.
Thank you, Katie. I think that's an important detail, and I will come back to that a bit later in the presentation. So how were these milestones achieved? That may be the second question that you're asking yourself at this point. Well, funding policy has been key, but it would be short-sighted to not acknowledge the profound importance investment performance has played as well. The focus today will be on the funding policy, but I will briefly come back to the relevance of investment performance toward the end of our report today. The funding policy, by the way, is approved and set by the MPERS Board of Trustees, and kudos to the board for making the difficult decisions over the last few decades associated with the aggressive funding policies of the system. So let's talk a little bit about the funding policy and how it has evolved here. Here's a brief picture for you illustrating 4 pivotal moments, if you will, in our history where the funding policy was adapted. And I'm going to dive briefly into each one of those. So back in 2006, the permanent policy was adapted and adjusted because at that time the board recognized that our funding progress was not what it needed to be and some adjustments needed to be made. Well, at that time, our amortization period for the liabilities, that is the debts of the system, the benefits that have been earned, those liabilities, we were funding those over an open 30-year period. So let's make that analogous to the mortgage on our homes. I think most of us have had a mortgage on our homes, and in many cases, we financed that debt over a 30-year period. Well, that's what we were doing in 2006. The difference is that rather than letting that decline or having a closed amortization period, we used an open amortization period, which means every year we refinanced the liability or that debt back to a 30-year period. And believe it or not, that was actually a common practice in that day. It wasn't something that we just did. Most of the systems across the country were doing that. But at that point in 2006, the board realized that wasn't going to work. we needed to close that amortization period, and they did. And it was a closed 30-year period, and it would decline 1 year every year thereafter to address the debts or the liabilities of the system. The great financial crisis further exacerbated the funding level of the system. So in 2010, the board adopted a temporary policy. At that time, a closer look at the retiree liabilities, which again were not fully funded, we found that the amortization period for the retiree liability was longer than the average life expectancy for our MPERS retirees. That meant that debt for retirees was going to be paid off after they had passed away. Clearly not a good situation to be in, so the board made the decision to be even more aggressive with the amortization period for retiree liabilities. And at that time, the board made the temporary policy such that retiree liabilities were financed over a closed 15-year period. Again, think of the mortgage on your home. If you finance that over a 30-year period, you have a certain amount of principal and interest. They decided to change that to a 15-year period, and then you would expedite that funding. I think that probably makes sense to everyone, but that's what was done in 2010. So again, the retiree liabilities were funded over a closed 15-year period, and every other liability was financed over a 30-year period. Right? The temporary policy would remain in effect until the retiree liability was fully funded, or when the permanent policy provided a higher contribution rate. Now, in 2014, the board had the opportunity to actually lower contribution rates as a result of positive experience, but no one was expecting that at the time. So the contribution rate stabilization reserve fund was created. And this may be a little confusing because it may sound like it's a distinct separate account, if you will. It's not. This is merely an accounting entry in our valuation report. And let me give you a simplified example. Let's pretend that we have around $4 billion in assets in the trust, okay? Or I'm sorry, $4 billion in liabilities in the trust are associated with the membership. Instead of financing or instead of using that level of liability to determine the contribution rates, we created this reserve fund to maintain the contribution rate at a higher level. And we added $250 million, which is the reserve, what was the reserve fund amount at that time, and determine the contribution rate based on that higher amount. Again, that can be confusing, but the point is the board decided to maintain the higher contribution rates at that time and establish this reserve fund to maintain that higher rate. And a tangential benefit of that was to protect against future volatility. So as experience came in where things were not as expected or came in lower than expected, we could use that reserve fund to kind of soften the blow, if you will, and use those reserve dollars to manage the contribution rate and maintain a lower volatility with the contribution rates. Again, a lot to take in there, but the point being that that was an adaptation made to the funding policy in 2014, which in my view, maybe it's hard to understand from the explanation I'll give you today, was one of the better decisions that the board has made over the long term. And that's not something that we're going to discuss in detail here, but it really has served us well over the years. And then lastly, the new permanent policy with divisional details was established this year. So when the time was approaching for the funding policy to revert back to the permanent policy, the board completed what is called an experience study. These are done at least every 5 years to review and affirm the overarching funding policy. At this time, the board realized some confusion had developed with the contribution rates due to the fact that the contribution rates for uniformed and non-uniformed employees had been essentially the same over the last decade. Now, these rates had been separate and distinct historically. They've never been the same. They're always calculated separately. And in order to reinforce that distinction, the board adopted divisional details, so it was clear there were two different rates for those two employee groups. The board also liked the path of progress from the temporary policy and decided to make it the permanent policy going forward. And that's where we stand today. Now let's bring in the vital signs into the discussion. And the vital signs are still relatively new. They relate to these milestones because they verify the expected outcomes of key metrics for the system. Eventually, the vital sign history will tell us a story, and then several of them relate directly to the funding policy.
Scott, this is Greta. If I could just interject here with a couple of details. It's important to understand that the vital signs are performance measurements, but they also allow the board to see where there might be risk. And as Scott will, you'll show everybody what these vital signs look like here in a minute. But built into these performance measures are parameters for risk. So when things aren't looking well, where the performance measurements aren't as expected, the board can see where we may have to, as staff, work closely on whatever the risks are that might be causing these issues. And it's just important to understand that that's how we utilize these vital signs, not just as performance measurements, but also as risk measurements.
Exactly. Thank you for that, Greta. So here is the dashboard that Greta referenced, and this is our new and improved vital sign dashboard. This is your one-page snapshot of all vital sign outcomes. And note here that the colors are relevant. You can see the stoplight there in the lower left-hand corner, and the round circle next to each of these metrics is green. And green is good, as you might expect. It means that things are as expected or they have passed. And in many cases, these vital signs are either a pass-fail circumstance, if you've done them or you didn't, or there is an expected numerical outcome that you would expect with certain parameters there. We're not diving into that today. And by the way, this is available on our website under the About Mosers tab if you want to dive into more details. But you can see here, all of the metrics on this year's dashboard are green. That's great. I will say that I think that's unusual. I think in most cases, in many years, there will be some exceptions to our expected outcomes. And again, this is the first year they were all green. So you would expect to see something yellow or perhaps even red in each year, with a few exceptions like this one where everything came out as we would like. I would want to point out special thanks to our assistant CFO, Lindsay Harris-Funk, for her help in developing this. Very much appreciate her time and energy in producing this. And we've been working on this for quite some time, honestly, and we're glad to finally get it out there in front of you. So it's not just for our board members, it is also for our members and other stakeholders to take a look at it. Again, it's available on our website under the About Mosers tab.
One thing I might add here, this is Greta again, that this may look like a lot of signs. However, this is just the board directed signs that they want to see, available to them at a glance. These are the things that they've identified as the most important performance measurements to give them a solid insight into what is happening in the system. And also an easy way for the public to understand at a glance what's happening at MPERS.
And I might add on to that, one of the things that you'll often hear us say about this dashboard is it represents the vital few metrics versus the trivial many. I think for years and years, we were guilty of giving the board, and maybe even our stakeholders, a massive list of performance measures that were frankly are hard to follow and understand. This one is much more simple and concise. And I think it is serving our board much better, serving us much better. And I think it will serve you as our members too and stakeholders. In a snapshot glance, you can see where things are as expected and where they're not.
Scott, this is Jennifer. I also wanted to add in, for the members' sake, that so they see this dashboard and think, well, how do we know that everything here is correct and what we're seeing is fairly presented? So we have the mentality of verify and trust. So going on that, the vital signs are part of the annual financial audit every year, and they are fully reviewed and verified by our external audit firm before we actually post them and provide them to the members.
All right, thank you, Jennifer and Greta. Now I will briefly reference a few of the vital signs that are connected to the funding policy. Obviously, the reason we are here is to pay the benefits earned by our members. This is the core reason for having the funding policy. If we are going to deliver the benefits that have been earned, we must fund them. Our track record here for initiating benefits is, as you would expect, good. And you can see each over the last 4 years when we've been measuring this, that we did get a passing grade, that we do issue our benefit payments on time and accurately. And I won't go down this tangent other than to say that that's not the common condition for our peers across the country. It is here in Missouri often the case, but in many instances, pension benefits are not paid on time or accurately for a variety of reasons. Again, that's another discussion for another day. But you should be pleased to see that we do have a great track record in that regard. The next vital sign reference is with the annual report. So you may be thinking this is a stretch to say the annual report is connected to MPERS funding policy. Nonetheless, I wanted to reference it because you as stakeholders to the system may find some of the details here important. Here again, you see we have successfully produced the annual report each of the last 4 years, and the report normally becomes available to the public around this time each year. Now, to some of the details in the report that may be of interest, I'll start with the transmittal letter, which is found in the introductory section of the report. And here's a glimpse of the highlights section. The overall transmittal letter is a fairly short read, but within it is this highlight section, which would recognize some of the key accomplishments for the current or the most recently completed fiscal year. Another example is the CIO report found in the investment section. And by the way, I should recognize that Larry Crewman, our CIO, is not with us today. He's on the road. Otherwise, he'd be here contributing to this conversation. But he produces a very nice report to the membership and to the board each year. And you can find it here in this section, in the investment section of the annual report. Again, short read with some very interesting and relevant details about the investment results for the most recently completed fiscal year. And the last example from the annual report can be found in the actuarial section. Here you will find a number of details relevant to the funding of the system. Now, back to the annual report as it relates to the vital signs, it is included here because it is a report card of sorts for the plan each year. Producing it according to reasonable and timely standards is an important expectation for our stakeholders.
Scott, I have one thing to add to that. So you talked about the annual report and it tying to the funded status. One of the really important things I think from the financial aspect is the audit report, and the system actually get a clean or unmodified audit report every year. That is one of the vital signs. And if anyone wants to look at the details of that, the financial section in the annual report is basically the full audit report in the larger annual report as you will see it. So
great, thank you, Jennifer. Now the next vital sign example is budget related. MPERS operating costs are a very small part of the overall funding picture, but they clearly are important. We use a cost per member comparison with our peers of similar size to be sure our administrative costs are not out of line. And here on this chart, you can see our results are represented each year by the blue bar for each year. And then the dotted line across the top represents the peer average. So we're well below our peers with regard to our cost per member analysis, which is reassuring that we are prudent and responsible with the costs associated for operating the fund. And then here's a quick glimpse that will reflect the operating budget as it in perspective to the overall benefit payment budget for the year. Very small slice there. And if you were to add the fees and expenses associated with our investments, would be even smaller. Again, just to give you a visual of where the operating budget fits into the overall budget for the system. And here is the last vital sign that I will connect to the funding policy. There are two funding sources for the payment of benefits for our plan. First is employer and employee contributions, and the second is investment income. If investment income is insufficient, it puts upward pressure on the contribution rates. If investment income is good, it minimizes the pressure on contribution rates. Now, earlier, I mentioned the lack of dedicated staff as a key contributor to the funding shortfalls of the past. Investment performance is a prime example for making that point. MPERS went from being one of the worst performing funds in the country from an investment performance perspective before it had staff to being one of the best performing funds in the country after it added staff. Investment results are not the only element to the funding policy, but they are clearly one of the more significant details. Now, as I wrap this up, I go back to the two key milestones identified earlier. Retiree liabilities are fully funded, and MPERS funded status is at an all-time high. Now, this is where I qualify things and acknowledge setbacks can and will occur. And frankly, we are overdue, in my view, for a step backward, especially with regard to our funded status. When you see this short chart, the blue bars there on the right, again, you see the positive progress we've had over the years. The common condition, frankly, is to see steps forward and maybe a step or two backward, depending on your actual experience. You don't see those steps backwards here. That has not occurred for quite some time. And that's why I say I think we're probably due or overdue, perhaps, for a setback. But that isn't a reason for concern. It's just part of the experience of managing a plan like this. That said, the funding policy remains aggressive and will continue the positive progress over the coming years toward the fully funded objective. Now, you may be asking, well, what are the next milestones? Well, I can't say I know for sure, but some of them could possibly be included here on this list. First of all, you see $4 billion in assets. Someone, I think maybe Katie mentioned that our asset level today is just over $3.8 billion in assets. There's nothing magical about hitting $4 billion other than it will represent another all-time high in assets for the trust. The next milestone could be our funded status of 80%. We're actually within just a few years of reaching an 80% threshold. There's nothing, again, magical about 80% other than it is often viewed as a healthy position for a pension plan like ours. But I will remind you again, our ultimate objective is to be fully funded or 100%. And that is the last objective you see here. When you think about the amortization period that I've talked about earlier with the funding policy, we're down to a 15-year period. So you would expect at the end of that 15-year period that our liabilities would go away, or the unfunded liabilities rather, would go away and we would become fully funded. So at the end of the day, what matters to our members most is the benefit they have earned. The details offered today are not directly relevant to the benefits you earn. That benefit is predicated on the length of your covered employment, the compensation that you have earned, and a multiplier set by law. These milestones are important because MPERS success is pivotal to its members. Members need a system they have confidence in and can count on. Being informed not just about the benefits you have or will earn, but about the general health and condition of the system is important to establishing that confidence. Thank you for taking time. Thank you for taking your time to become more informed about your pension system.
All right. So thank you all for joining us today and taking time to learn about your MPERS benefits and the milestones that define our success. A special thank you to our panelists, Greta Bassett-Seymour, Katie Lacey, Jennifer Even, and Scott Simon, for sharing their expertise and providing valuable insights into the critical areas of benefit administration, financial operations, human resources, and investments. Your dedication to MPERS and its mission is truly appreciated, and today's discussion has highlighted the strength and stability of our system. So you can find a recording of this presentation on our website in the next few days, and if you have any additional questions or thoughts, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at communications@mpers.org. Thank you again for your participation today, and we look forward to keeping you informed and involved in the future. Have a wonderful day.